Your life's work is a sandcastle, the Buddha's path to real meaning of happiness. The Pali word that we translate as happiness, Sukha, actually has a very wide range of meanings, everything from physical pleasure to well-being, bliss, ease, the whole gamut of all kinds of physical and mental well-being. Sometimes happy seems to be the right translation, and sometimes it seems a little bit airheaded. Years back, when we were first translating the chants here, I went to a meeting where there were some nuns and monks from England. Over there, they translate the passage, Aham Sukhito Homi, as may I abide in well-being, which a friend of mine called Benedictine Pali. One of the nuns was curious to hear how we translated the passage, and so I told her, may I be happy. She started laughing so hard she almost fell out of her chair. I guess she felt that the simple wish for happiness was kind of airheaded. So if you have that feeling around the word happiness, remember that Sukha covers a lot of other things as well. The Buddha himself said that another word for happiness is acts of merit. Merit is another one of those words we have trouble with. It sounds like merit badges and brownie points. But what he's saying is that happiness lies in the action of doing something good. He lists 3 kinds of meritorious actions: generosity, virtue, and meditation. And those 3 activities cover pretty much all the goodness in the world. The acts that give meaning to our lives come under these 3 headings. Generosity means not only giving material things, but also giving your time, giving your energy, giving forgiveness, giving help in all kinds of ways. It's in the act of giving that a lot of us find meaning in our lives. The time we give, the love we give to others, the care and concern. The act itself is a form of happiness, a form of sukha. The same with virtue. This has more to do with refraining from things where you could harm other people or yourself, or you could do something that was for your advantage that would take something away from someone else. You may find yourself in a situation where you could do something of that sort and maybe get away with it, yet you don't do it. You have a sense that your worth as a person is much more important than whatever little gain you might get from behaving in lowly ways. That's another area where we can find a lot of meaning in our lives. And then there's meditation. The Pali word here is bhavana, which means developing good qualities in the mind. We primarily think of meditation in terms of developing mindfulness and alertness and other good qualities as we sit here and do formal meditation, but it applies to all areas where you see that your mind needs to train itself in noble qualities, in your thoughts, your words, and your deeds. So when we say, may I be happy, may all living beings be happy, it's not that we're hoping for everyone to sit around grinning, surrounded by nice sights, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations. Basically, it means that we hope that they do good, because that's where the happiness lies. The meaning of happiness. Sometimes you run into descriptions of the Buddha's teachings on happiness that sound pretty hedonistic. A few years back, I was going to give a talk on a Buddhist perspective on the pursuit of happiness. In the afternoon before the talk, I happened to meet with my old Christian ethics professor from college. He asked me what I was going to say that night, and I decided to boil it down to one sentence, which was, the pursuit of happiness doesn't need to be hedonistic. In other words, the wish for happiness is not simply about gathering up pleasures. He said, I wish I had the time and opportunity to come and hear that. Sometimes you hear mindfulness sold as a way of enjoying your pleasures more. The more mindful you are, they say, the more pleasure you find in simple physical sensations. This idea is especially common when they practice eating raisins as a mindfulness practice. You find there's a lot more flavor to the raisin when you savor it slowly. There's a lot more pleasure in the experience of drinking tea when you sip it slowly, enjoying the warmth of the cup in your hand, that kind of thing. Yet, a psychology professor writing about positive psychology pointed out that of various approaches to pleasure and happiness in life, such as mastering a skill or devoting yourself to a higher purpose, the lowest is trying to enjoy sensual pleasures. All he knew about Buddhism was the Raisin mindfulness school. When he described Buddhism, he was trying to write about it in a respectful way, but he couldn't help but place Buddhism at the very lowest end of the various approaches to happiness in the world. This is what happens when you try to sell Buddhism in a way that you think is going to appeal to people, teaching them that if you practice mindfulness, you can squeeze a lot more happiness out of consuming the pleasures in life. So there is that understanding about Buddhism going around out there, but it's not what the Buddha taught. As he actually said, the happiness lies in the actions. When you do something skillful, something noble, that's where the real happiness lies. Both because there's a sense of well-being as you do the action. You realize that what you're doing is not harming anybody, and in the sense that it's going to produce happiness down the line, both for yourself and for others. In this sense, the Buddha wants you to take the pursuit of happiness seriously. You would think that people would stop and think about how they're trying to be happy, but they don't. They just follow their urges. This may be one of the reasons that happiness has bad press in some areas, because a lot of what people do when they're trying to be happy is to block out huge patches of reality so that they can just focus on what they like and pretend that what they're doing has no impact aside from the immediate sensation of pleasure. If you want happiness, that's true. The Buddha wants us to be very clear-sighted about our happiness, all the implications of where we look for happiness and how. If you want happiness that's true, he said, you have to develop qualities of wisdom, compassion, and purity. These are all noble qualities in the mind. Without them, there is no true happiness. Wisdom starts by seeing that pleasure and pain, happiness and sadness come from your actions. They're not just a matter of things floating by. So you've got to be very careful about what you do and say and think, because some things lead to short-term happiness and then long-term pain. Other things might be difficult in the doing, but they lead to long-term happiness. Seeing that and being able to talk yourself into doing those things that will lead to long-term happiness, regardless of whether they're easy or not, that's a real function of wisdom. As for compassion, you have to realize that if your happiness depends on other people's suffering, it's not going to last. It's not going to be true happiness. So you have to take their needs into account. As for purity, you look at your actions and see, do they really fall in line with your values, your desire to be compassionate, your desire to be wise? You don't go just on good intentions. The Buddha makes the distinction. There are good intentions and there are skillful intentions. With good intentions, you may mean well, but you can end up causing a lot of harm because you're not really looking carefully at what you're doing or the results of what you're doing. You're deluded. Skillful intentions, which are free from delusion, are the ones that actually do lead to happiness. To be skillful like this, you've got to keep checking your actions again and again and again to see what results you're actually getting, to make sure that you're acting on your best intentions and your best understanding of what's going to happen as a result. You also keep in mind that there are situations where you may not know, and the only way to gain knowledge is to experiment and learn from your actions too. You've got to do your best, or at least what seems to be most skillful, and watch for the results. All of that, the Buddha identifies as the quality of purity. So, there are good, noble qualities that you can develop in the mind through the wise pursuit of happiness. And it's in developing those noble qualities that true happiness lies, true well-being, true bliss, or however else you want to translate the word Sukha. So as we meditate, We're here partly for the sake of the sense of ease and well-being that comes as you get the mind to settle down, but also for the sake of using that settled well-being as a tool to gain greater insight into the mind and to strengthen our generosity, strengthen our virtue, strengthen all good qualities in the mind that need to be developed. The pleasure of the meditation is happy in the doing, but it's also a tool for an even greater happiness. And this is what gives meaning to our lives, the fact that the mind is developed. There are a lot of things that we try to accomplish in life that depend on outside situations, projects we'd like to do, goals we'd like to realize in the outside world. Sometimes we actually do accomplish them, but then someone comes along and erases our accomplishment. Look at the tide of history. Things go back and forth, like the tides of the sea. And if your sense of accomplishment or meaning lies in the sense that you've made a permanent change in the world, it's going to be disappointed. It'll be washed away, like sand castles when the tide turns. I remember listening to a lawyer who had argued many cases before the Supreme Court. He was talking about how, when he started out his career, things seemed to be heading toward greater and greater freedom, greater equality, and greater goodness in general. But then, the tide turned, and he saw all his accomplishments being frittered away by one court case after another. So if you're looking for meaning in those terms, the world is a pretty cruel and heartless place. But if you look in terms of the good qualities you can develop in the mind, they don't have to depend on the world outside. And the actions that you do that are skillful, that are meritorious, that are meaningful, these are things that give real meaning to life. The qualities of virtue, generosity, and all the other things that the Buddha describes as inner treasures or inner perfections. Those are what real happiness means. Examine your happiness. During my years in Thailand, I was often asked why I ordained, why I was interested in Buddhism, but one time I was asked a more specific version of that question. What was it that Ajahn Fuang taught that attracted me to him particularly? I didn't have a ready answer right away, but as I thought about it, I began to realize that there was one teaching that had really struck me when I first went to stay with him, which is that this practice is all about purifying the heart. As he said, everything else in the practice is just games. The real thing, the serious part, the earnest part of the practice is purifying the heart. That resonated. When we think in these terms, it helps give a sense of direction to what we're doing and helps us check what we're doing. There's a passage where the Buddha says, "You know another person's purity by the way that person has dealings with others." In other words, when you engage in a trade, are you fair? When you engage in an argument, are you fair? Do you take advantage of other people's weaknesses? Do you make underhanded arguments? Do you take more from others than you give, or do you give more? You can use the same principle looking at the mind to figure out what is meant by purity of heart and mind. How does your mind deal with itself? How do you deal with the world? Basically, how do you feed on the world? How do you look for your pleasure? How do you look for your happiness? Do you give more than you take, or do you take more than you give? When the Buddha uses the metaphor of feeding, it has a really deep meaning because you begin to realize that ultimately, the only pure happiness is one where you're not feeding at all, in any way, physically or mentally. But on the way there, you're going to have to feed. First, though, it's good to think about happiness. What is happiness? The Pali term Sukha has a wide range of meanings. It starts with basic pleasure and ease and works up to well-being and bliss. But it's one of those terms that the Buddha never defines. Lots of other terms he defines very precisely, but some of the really basic terms, mind, citta, happiness, sukha, and stress, dukkha, never get defined. The teaching is basically about training the mind to end stress and find true happiness, but of these terms, only training is defined. In the case of happiness and stress, he gives examples, but he doesn't provide a formal definition. And I think part of the reason is that he wants you to take a close look at where you search for your happiness and what you regard as happiness. The same with dukkha. He wants you to look at the direct experience of stress and suffering in your internal sense of your mind. Your understanding of all these terms is going to develop and grow more refined as you practice, as you look at them more carefully. So it's good to stop and think. What does happiness mean to you? How do you go about it? What kind of trades do you make with the world? What kind of deals do you make with the world in order to get the happiness you want? And what are the results? As the Buddha said, the happiness we're looking for in the practice is one that's not only solid but also blameless. In other words, in your trades with the world and in the way you feed off the world, are you giving more than you take? Are you taking more than you give? If you take more, there's something blameworthy there. If there's any harm involved in what you're doing, either harming yourself by breaking the precepts, trying to incite yourself to passion, aversion, and delusion, or harming others by getting them to do those things, then there's something in your happiness that's not pure. There's also the issue of the effort you put into that happiness. Is it worth it? Do you really get the happiness you want from it? What's the cost of this happiness you're pursuing? You want to look at this balance sheet very carefully. One of the reasons we practice concentration is to gain a sense of the range of happiness, the range of well-being that the mind is capable of. For a lot of people, sitting and meditating is not easy. Almost everyone has hardships. The few people who don't have hardships, as I've said many times, are like flowers that were ready for the Buddha to pick. We weren't ready at the time, so we still have to struggle. The Buddha was often clear about the fact that skillful practices can involve both pain and pleasure, and that unskillful practices can involve both pleasure and pain. You've got to look past the immediate pleasure and pain to sort out which kind of happiness, in the long term, is worth pursuing. With every effort you make, you want to examine what's the amount of happiness you gain as a result. Psychologists have noticed again and again, and not just psychologists, almost everyone has noticed this in other people, that we tend to overestimate certain pleasures, the ones we like to like. We dress them up for ourselves to make us want to go back to them again and again. Yet when you actually look at the direct experience of these things, there's not much there. So the Buddha wants you to get a better sense of what happiness is, what well-being is, what bliss is. The bliss of concentration is an acquired taste. It's a specific kind of happiness, which the Thais call santi sukha, which literally means the happiness of peace. This is a basic level of well-being that we tend to overlook because it carries no excitement, no thrills. It's just a basic sense of ease that's steady, like the flame of an oil lamp. For most of us, we notice pleasure and pain because of the back and forth, the ups and the downs. When things are steady and on an even keel, we tend to lose interest and not notice them. But that's precisely the kind of well-being we're working on here. The kind of happiness that's steady, that doesn't go up and down. We have to learn how to appreciate that. As we stick with it more and more, we begin to realize that we wouldn't want to be without this kind of happiness, without this kind of well-being. But then the next question is it really steady? As you examine it, you find that it, too, involves a certain level of feeding. You're feeding off of the breath, the ease you can create with the breath. You're also feeding off of the steadiness of the intentions that keep you here. But over time, you get more and more sensitive to the fact that even the steadiness of concentration is not totally steady. It involves a very subtle kind of movement, back and forth, sometimes more intense, sometimes less, but there's always a slight inconstancy to it. You want to get sensitive to that because that's what motivates you to look for something better. But in the beginning of your concentration practice, you want to focus on the steadiness. That's what motivates you to get into the concentration to begin with and to try to stay there. We often hear the Buddha talking about how the 5 aggregates are stressful because they're inconstant, and as a result, we're taught not to identify with them, but there are levels of the teaching where the Buddha says you don't focus on that yet. You focus instead on the fact that some aspects of form, feeling, perception, mental fabrication, and consciousness are actually pleasant, and you want to pursue them for that pleasure. There's the pleasure of the precepts, the pleasure of generosity, both of which are conditioned things. There's the pleasure in concentration, which is also conditioned, and you want to motivate yourself to develop that and to appreciate it so that it can provide you with nourishment on the path. If you jump right in and say, well, everything is inconstant, stressful, and not self, so let's just go beyond the concentration and move on to the next step, not bother with working on the concentration. That simply short-circuits the path. It starves the path. You're gaining training in happiness. You're gaining sensitivity in what it means to experience well-being, so that you'll be able to recognize the ultimate well-being when it comes. Even though the path involves a kind of feeding, it's the kind of feeding you need so that you're not feeding on something more blameworthy, something more unskillful. This is the happiness that's relatively pure, not absolutely pure because there's still a kind of feeding. Still, at this point you need to feed, so you go for what's relatively better. As the Buddha noticed when he was practicing, if he didn't eat, he couldn't practice right concentration. The body needs nourishment, the mind needs nourishment, but you need to learn to be pure in your dealings with other people. You need to try to be fair. Having this internal source of food helps you to be less grasping and needy in your dealings with others. Still, there comes a point when you realize that even the purity of concentration is only a relative kind of purity. You want to look deeper. The only absolutely pure way that you can engage with the world is if you don't have to feed on it anymore. You don't have to take anything. This is why the arahants don't store up food. A layperson who becomes an arahant has to ordain because that person just doesn't want to store food, doesn't want to take from the world anymore. Such a person is willing to live off what is offered day by day. The idea of going out and taking things from other beings is repugnant. Only if those beings are happy to give it do arahants want to receive. So take a good close look at what well-being means to you. What is happiness? What is pleasure? What does ease mean to you? What does bliss mean to you? In English, we talk about blissing out with the emphasis usually on the out, in that the pleasure is making you oblivious, which is the problem with that kind of bliss. But what would true bliss mean where you're not blissing out, but just blissing, where there's just bliss and lots of awareness, with no feeding at all? Your dealings with the world are entirely pure. What would that be like? A happiness that doesn't involve any feeding. It's hard for us to imagine that because all of our happiness involves feeding one way or another, and it's good to become sensitive to that fact. So even though a totally pure happiness may be a long way off, we can be more and more pure in our dealings with the world as we try to find happiness and figure out what happiness is, realizing that certain types of happiness that we've enjoyed in the past, when you really start looking at them carefully, are really not worth it. Happiness that comes from gain, status, praise. You want to be able to see through that so that you don't go trying to grab it from the world. Instead, you want to turn inside and see what is it about the way the mind relates to itself. What are your dealings with your own mind? And to what extent are you honest with yourself about what happiness is and in what you're doing to get it? And what are the results of the way you're getting it? How do these things all balance out? It's in sensitizing yourself to these issues that you get a better and better sense of what a pure happiness would be. So these are some of the reasons why the Buddha doesn't define terms like happiness and suffering, because all too often if you think of the term as defined and you assume you know it when actually you don't. Happiness is an undefined term that's really important in our lives, and yet all too often we don't really look carefully at the experience of happiness. We don't think seriously about happiness. We just see other people going for this pleasure or that, and we think it looks like fun, so we follow them without really looking at what we're doing. The Buddha wants you to look very carefully inside yourself. What are your dealings with the world? What are your dealings inside over the issue of happiness? To what extent do you lie to others? To what extent do you lie to yourself? To what extent do you harm others? To what extent do you harm yourself in your search for happiness? Can you clean up your act? This is something we all have to look at deeply within ourselves in order to answer properly. But the proper answer is, yes, you can do it. You can clean up your act if you see that it's important enough. So try to nurture that sense of its importance. After all, we live for the sake of happiness. Everything we do is for the sake of pleasure, so let's make it a pure pleasure, a pure happiness, a pure bliss that involves no harm, no feeding at all.